We often speak about the 4 Ps of marketing in a consumer business. Every time we talk about FMCG, it's price, place, promotion, and product. But you know what? It's the 5th P that impacts all these 4. And that 5th P is politics. The Sitapati Brothers. Sudhir is an FMCG veteran and Vinay is an academic expert on politics. Between the two of them, they have 3 books written, all of them bestsellers and among my favorites. So it was only fair that I sat them down to discuss the impact political regimes and policies and elections have on consumption. It's important to track ahead of so many state elections and the central election next year. This is The Weekender on CNBC-TV18.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining in. Sudhir, I have to tell you, FMCG is life, but I read Half Lion much before I knew of you at HUL and thereafter at Godrej Consumer. How does that feel?
Well, he's the more famous Sitapati, so it's natural.
And you're
He's a richer Sitapati.
I must say that CEO Factory as a book was inspired by Vinay, so I think you should ask Vinay how he wrote Half Lion first.
Speaking about Half Lion, you know, Narasimha Rao, not many know about the person. How did that subject fascinate you? How did you write that book?
Well, so I am not Telugu and I didn't know much about Narasimha Rao other than the joke that he knew how to be silent in 10 languages, right? So these were the jokes about him. But, you know, I was doing my PhD at Princeton University and I was getting more and more interested in India changing in the 90s. Something changed. I remember standing in line when the first McDonald's came to India in the mid-90s.
I remember.
So there was something there, right? And then I read a biography of Deng Xiaoping and it was a fantastic biography of Deng, his life and the life of China changing in the 80s. And I said, wait a minute, this is the parallel of India in the 1990s and the Prime Minister happened to be Narasimha Rao. All his negatives, his affairs, his corruption I talk about, but I also talk about the fact that in my opinion, he was the greatest Prime Minister in India. And so I then, you know, started, you know, meeting his family after, you know, they met me many times and they said, listen, you know, finally, you know, we trust you. And his youngest son, Prabhakar Rao, took me to his terrace or to the rooftop, which was closed, to say that, look, there are about 45 cartons here. These were my father's private papers. And I sort of, you know, supplemented that with about 100 interviews. The benefits that liberalization has given us was not inevitable. And even today, as we are pushing for more economic reforms, more liberalization, technocracy ain't going to do it. So there was no new thinking in the early 90s. What was new was the political ability to implement. And I think that your viewers especially, they focus on economics, they focus on the stock market. My only request is that don't write politics out of the story.
On the other side, there was a parallel track in your elder brother who was, you know, was finding his footing in the FMCG industry at that point. What were the changes there? How did consumption pattern change during liberalization post that?
You know, I joined the FMCG industry in the late 90s. And the early 2000s, paradoxically, due to liberalization, was actually a tough period for FMCG. And in hindsight, we realized that a lot of consumption went into telecom. I mean, then, of course, you know, after 2005 and 6, for a decade, there was a lot of growth in FMCG and that market boomed. And things are very, very different today when I look at the FMCG industry and consumer consumption today versus what they were in 1999.
Policies and politics, how do they impact consumption? Do you have any empirical evidence from both your experiences on that?
So one is, you know, are the policies pro-growth, pro-welfare?
Right.
So, you know, what Revdi culture versus GDP culture. But there's a third element, which is inflation. So, you know, you can have policies that, you know, increase consumption in, say, rural areas like the NREGA did. But we also know from the UPA time that had a huge effect on inflation. So that's the complex metrics. And even when you look at Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what he's trying to ask is, you know, should I spend on capital expenditure? Today, it may not bring benefits. 10 years from now, a highway brings benefits. How much should I spend on Revdi? It brings me elections results in the next 4-5 years. And in doing so, what are the consequences on inflation? And it's this complex balancing where politics, policy, and economics kind of play together that every Prime Minister is dealing with day in and day out.
I think between 91 and 2000, the FMCG industry saw a boom. That was led by supply chain factors, licensing, you know, industry being delicensed, you know, cost of production falling, etc. Then surprisingly, between the late 90s and 2005, when GDP growth went up, for a period FMCG actually saw slower growth, because as GDP went up, people started consuming different things. Then for another decade, we saw a lot of broad-based growth in FMCG, perhaps to do with things like MNR, EGA, etc., etc. And over the last few years, we have broadly seen a trend of premiumization.
That mean that, you know, premiumization was a function of growth-related policies, capex-heavy budgets, and mass consumption was a factor of, say, the MNREGS scheme and people having more money in the hands. Would you?
Yeah, but I think in addition to that, I think that is correct. In addition, I think premiumization has to do with the fact that the state just gets out of the way. So yes, the nature of state spending, whether it's in capital expenditure or it's in revenue, does make a difference in who is consuming. The core idea in 1947 was that India is backward, its villages are backward. We need a strong state in order to push India into modernity. Post 1990, the ideological shift, which whether you're Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao, Deve Gowda, or indeed Narendra Modi, is that, look, the state has to be a supporting actor. It cannot be the primary actor in the economy. I think that itself has led to a lot of premiumization.
Where we are right now, how do you view the consumer sentiment in the country at this point in time?
As things stand today, I think a lot of people are speaking of the K-shaped recovery, the top 20%, e-commerce, modern trade doing well, rural, small towns under a little bit of pressure. But I think it will change. I think these are all the ups and downs that you have in any business. I think the bigger story is that India has about 25 to 30 years of very, very fast consumer FMCG growth left in it, given where consumption is today.
From your business standpoint, what was it that you learned from him?
So, if you look at his books and the way he writes his books, he writes his chapter titles first, he writes a précis on each chapter, and then he writes the books. That's a very useful way of thinking in business, which is to have hypothesis first. A lot of us are fact first, and then you're like swimming in an ocean of facts. The other alternative approach which Vinay follows in writing books is hypothesis. You make up your mind, and as the data comes, you change your mind. So you got to be flexible on it. You can't like make up your mind and not change your mind. When I was asked to interview for Godrej, I first wrote my hypothesis down on Godrej.
Got it.
Then I asked Nisaba to send me some data on Godrej. Then I refined that hypothesis. Then when I joined Godrej, I spent 2-3 months traveling around Godrej and I refined that hypothesis. And then after I've still got that original hypothesis. The thing that I'm not sure I always do, but the thing that certainly you have to keep in mind is that you cannot get dogmatic about hypothesis.
Yeah, you cannot be in love with your own original assumptions.
What is it that you're witnessing over what's happening in the country right now with from a Godrej business standpoint?
The way we look at our Godrej businesses is, regardless of the short term, providing you believe in the long term, you got to develop categories far and ahead of the natural rate of growth of those categories. And therefore, what we need to do in Godrej is get this business to double-digit volume growth. If India was not on a broad secular growth, then this would be different. But given the fact that you're on a broad upward trend, there are plenty of categories having lots of growth. The job for us in Godrej is to develop categories so that we trump the economic growth that is up or down in any given year.
Do you think over the last few years, this job of developing categories which are likely to grow ahead of the market in general has been, perhaps outsourced or taken up by a lot of the new age entrepreneurs who are looking at alternate channels, the D2C brands, etc.?
I would certainly say there have been many categories, a lot of them in e-commerce, D2C, technology, but also otherwise, that have innovated really well and taken a share of growth. So a lot of the time we think about share of market, you have to look at share of consumption. And if you look at share of consumption, you have to innovate so that your share of wallet goes up compared to others. I would certainly say that some categories have done it much better than many categories in FMCG.
What would then you do to perhaps bring that growth to those categories? Acquisition was one of them. We saw that with the Raymond consumer business. What are the other things that you're doing?
Two things. One is you got to innovate and get new products out into the market. And second is you got to, after getting a new product, it takes a long time for it to build, So you have to bet behind these innovations, which I call market development, for a long period of time for them to take off. Like a great innovation has been Magic Hand Wash, which has been a powder to liquid hand wash. We've had recent success in a good innovation called cockroach anti-roach gel, which is a gel that you stick in various parts of the houses, and when you come back the next morning, all the cockroaches that were there all over the house, including hidden corners, die, and that's had really explosive growth. Our air care category has really ridden this theme of premiumization really well. So there are plenty of categories in Godrej and GCPL, both in India and the rest of the world, which are trumping GDP growth and growing faster than that.
How important do you think is the 2024 election for you to decide where to put the next dollar in?
80% of our growth is driven by what we do, and 20% is what is driven by the macro. So rather than spending all your time thinking about the macro, it is better for you to think about what you can do.
The next few months have a bunch of state elections, all leading up to the big central election. How do you view the situation right now?
I think there are two basic changes when it comes to state versus center. One is, especially under Mr. Modi, the two have become delinked, where the central government is seen as a referendum on Modi personally, whereas state elections are seen as much more a referendum on state issues, state performance, a lot of local level factors. So I think that's one huge delinking that has happened. So I think the big message there is that whatever the state election results, they should not be seen as a semi-final for next year, because that delinking, especially under Mr. Modi, is quite strong. The other thing is that you're seeing something closer to a pro-incumbency effect than before, which is unique when it comes to state elections in particular. So I would say these are the two takeaways, and the big one is that don't see this as a semi-final. Think about the national elections separately and with a separate set of factors than these.
Post 2014, do you think the underlying tonality of politics has moved? People are speaking the language of success of Mr. Modi, where he speaks about development, he speaks about all these factors. Now you have other political parties speak about that as well.
Yeah, but I won't put it down only to Mr. Modi. There's been a general trend since I would say 1991, where there was an emphasis that development works. I think Mr. Modi's genius is that he is the best marketeer of this product. Whereas, I think other political parties, especially the Congress, are like, listen, if we talk about development too much, do we look at as pro-rich? But I think Mr. Modi's ability to give a singular message, a very clear message, is what makes him seen as Mr. Development. But frankly, it's an all India story. And as you said, many state governments are also singing the same tune.
The liberalization benefits more or less in the price, as they say in the stock market. The next leg of growth, do you think manufacturing is one of them, that the whole Make in India, PLI sort of schemes that have been announced, will that be the engine that fires the next leg of growth?
Well, let me answer that question historically, Mangalam, which is that I think one of the reasons why service sector boomed post 1991 was that it required less of the state. So the IT sector broadly required the state to get out of the way. Manufacturing, on the other hand, if you looked at the manufacturing powerhouses of the 20th century, East Asia, for example, China, they've also required good state support, right? The million-dollar question in India is the state, not the Modi government, not the state government, but the state, is the Mai Baap Sarkar capable of manufacturing friendly growth? I'm not so sure about that. Don't forget, like for example, the MITI, the ministry that promoted industry in Japan, was very efficient, very honest, and was far-sighted. Will we be able to say this about various ministries whether it's the central government or the state government? Do you suddenly expect a joint secretary who used to revel in the license Raj to suddenly administer a PLI system better? That's where my hesitation comes from.
How would you view this as a person who's running businesses?
I mean, India, and in particular in the context of GCPL, is becoming a relatively easier manufacturing hub. We just announced a large investment in Tamil Nadu. Certainly at a state level, we have been very happy with the interaction and the support that we've got from the state of Tamil Nadu. India definitely has some advantages in being a global manufacturing hub compared to some time ago. I think the ports work better. States are very, very sort of competitive in getting investments, so they're very helpful in getting permissions, etc. I think there's a certain amount of critical mass of skilled labor that's available in India. At the same time, labor prices are low. There is plenty of availability of a wide range of raw materials in India. I think there are a lot of stars aligning for India to be a global manufacturing hub. But on the other hand, there is a counter to it, which is manufacturing today is a lot more automated than it was in the 80s as well. So I don't know whether it will generate the same amount of jobs that it did in the past. I don't know, and it depends on what kind of manufacturing. But I see personally from the Godrej example, a lot of stars aligning for India to be a good manufacturing hub.
Both of you all come from different vantage points, but obviously meet at common ground, which is India right now. You see the world through your business eyes, you see the world through the eyes of academia. And do you really believe that the next decade or two belong to India when it comes to supernormal growth?
This idea of Make in India was embedded into us. My father, after finishing his engineering in IIT Powai, he went to New York University, but he came back to India. And my mother is a sociologist, she's gone to villages in India, she understands Indian society. And from a very early age, the two of us, for us, our family outings was going to an Indus Valley site, Dholavira, or going to Ajanta and Ellora caves. This idea that this is a rich and deep civilization with enormous self-correcting methods, right? That if every time we go a little bit left, little bit right, the society itself has a genius to it. I think that's what, at least the two of us bet on. That's why I came back to India. That's why he's had multiple opportunities to go abroad, to be, to work in global companies. But for him, his heart has always been here. Now, Indian states, ministers may come, ministers may go, prime ministers come, prime ministers go. But I think that if you take that view of India, I think our civilization is definitely in the cusp of greatness. Any of your investors taking a long-term view, this is a civilization that is rising. And it's a country that therefore you should bet on.
One of the things I observe when I go across the world is that Indians have a tremendous sense of entrepreneurship. You will find in Africa, in Southeast Asia, a lot of the entrepreneurs are either Indian or Chinese. That keeps the Indian market incredibly competitive. As the opposite side of it, when I look at other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, kind of discipline and order and doing things in a systematic way, India is probably one notch lower than its certainly many peers in even Latin America actually and Southeast Asia and even parts of Africa. So I think that's the pro and con of India. Tremendous entrepreneurial energy, but relatively lower regimentation, I suppose, than the countries that I see.
More of Jugaad and less of Jugalbandi is what you would say.
The title of my second book, Jugalbandi, is precisely because, and this will be ironic to say, that BJP is a deeply un-Indian organization, and self-consciously so. That in India, we are all prima donnas, we all want to be leaders of teams, we don't know how to work together. In that, a culture in which teamwork is emphasized is frankly un-Indian. But in that sense, it's funny to say, but the Congress is a deeply quote-unquote Indian organization.
From a Godrej standpoint, three key perceptions that you had before you joined, which have been changed after you joined.
So I think it's a highly values-driven organization with unusually high governance levels, going back to some of Vinay's points on being a little, different in that sense. History of entrepreneurship and history of innovation, history of scientific innovation and frugality in cost. These have been really good. I think the degree of professionalization in certain areas like technology, marketing, etc. was good but not great. And these are areas that we've focused on, which is to enable a better use of technology, the science of marketing, the science of innovation versus, like the art of innovation. So I guess these are the areas where Godrej probably needs to get better at.
What do you think then would be the risk to all this optimism that we have, not only about the consumer sentiment, India as a civilization and all that?
Well, the one thing that keeps striking me is something academics actually are not very good at, which is delivery. Like, you have these policies, you have a PLI scheme in manufacturing. Can you deliver, right? And in India, it is again delivery, delivery and delivery. Focus on delivery requires discipline, requires regimentation, requires listening. These are not skills Indians are famous for.
What would you say from a business standpoint?
From a business standpoint, not to do with my current role in Godrej, but I worked in foods for a long time, prior to that, almost a decade. And the development of Indian agriculture and food processing is very crucial. I would say 40 to 50% get their employment primarily from agriculture, even though it's less than 20% as a contributor to GDP. So to crack the problem of food processing and agriculture would be a meaty, meaningful challenge for us going forward.
India in 3 years, India in 5 years, India in 10 years, in one word each.
India in 3 years, I would say chaotic, but India in 1,000 years, as stable as it is always.
Godrej in 3 years, Godrej in 5 years.
Godrej in 3 years, I hope will be the most innovative FMCG company in India. And I hope in 5 or 10 years is the most innovative company that solves consumer needs across the world.
Your top 3 prime ministers of the country.
I'd certainly say Narasimha Rao is one.
Obviously, you wrote a book on him.
I'd say, I mean, in terms of consequential, I'd say both Modi and Nehru would be number 2. Both. And ironically, because, they do come from vast, but in terms of remolding the idea of India to their image, I would put both of them as strong number 2s. The reason I put Narasimha number 1 is that he inherited a lot more problems than the other 2.
The top 3 consumer companies of India which are not HUL and Godrej Consumer.
I'm a big admirer of DMart and what they have done in the recent past. I've been an admirer of Nestle as well for consistent results over 20-25 years. I've also been an admirer, I guess it's a bit of a cliche, but of Asian Paints for what they've done to the supply chain. So I guess these are companies I'm admirers of.
You know what happened the last time we spoke about different companies, right? So you were in Unilever, you went to GCPL, and now you're speaking about Nestle, Asian Paints and DMart. We'll keep an eye out on that, but nothing happening in the very near future for sure, right?
That's very funny.
Well, yeah. Well, I hope not.
But talking about the near future, what are you working on? You've spoken about 2 prime ministers, rather 3 prime ministers, but I'm sure you would be wanting to write about others as well.
Yeah, well, so I have these 2 projects. One is for the last year I've been working on, both a biography of Manmohan Singh in the context of kind of economic transformation of India. But more immediately, me and this fantastic Stanford academic Dinsha Mistry were working on a project on the success of Indians in America. Which is just astonishing.
It's phenomenal. 25 CEOs is what I read. The list keeps updating every month or 2, and the combined market cap of Indian origin CEOs of the world is close to around $5 trillion. So we might not have been a $5 trillion economy yet, but in terms of Indians heading companies will be $5 trillion.
Yeah,
That'd be interesting.
What's the secret sauce? What's the Brahmastra that enables this to happen?
What is it?
Well, that's the book.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. This was great. I'm not letting you go without you showing me your sitar room.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, let's go. Sudhir, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thanks, Mangalam. I'm doing a duress. I haven't touched this instrument for a few years.
Doesn't matter, but the way you're holding it, it looks like you've been playing it for a very long time anyway. This wonderful place, it's inspired by your love for art?
Well, yeah, I mean, the name of this place is Malhar, so maybe I'll play a few strains from Rag Malhar.
Let's do that. Sitapati with the sitar. Wow. I mean, had you played a little more than what you did, it would have started raining.
Come on.
Well, we're talking about the India theme, India, everything. Can you play something that encapsulates India according to you? I mean, is there a tune that you have? Wow, ended on that wonderful Rag Des note. Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for doing this
Thanks
for
so
me.
much.